what really summarizes the problem with the land debate in South Africa is a land reform summit that I attended in 2018. And the spokesperson for the Department of Land Reform spoke at this summit, and he gave this speech along the lines of what I just did when I steelmanned the argument about historic injustices and white people are wealthy and black people are poor and we need land reform and so forth. But he kept conflating, again, the idea of restitution and redistribution. So he would talk about addressing historic injustices, but then he would conflate that with we need to take land that belongs to white people. As if you're white and you own land, it's because of an injustice by definition. And so he spoke about correcting historic injustices through redistribution on a racial basis. And then after his speech, I asked him a question and I said, here's a hypothetical situation and I want to know what is the government's position on this. And so the situation is there's a piece of land that is owned by a white farmer. And because of historical injustices, that has to be corrected. And so the government takes that land from that farmer, chases the farmer off the land, and then gives that piece of land to a black person to become a farmer, to farm on this property. So in other words, the historic injustice has now been corrected. What happens then if that black farmer decides 2 years down the line that he doesn't want to be a farmer anymore and he wants to sell his property? He puts it in the market and the purchaser is white. And then 2 years down the line, a white guy buys the land from this black farmer. What's the government's position on this? Is this an injustice or not? Because the owner of the land is white. And his words were actually shocking. His words were, in that case, the correction of the injustice has been reversed. So in other words, the fact that the new person that owns the land is white, by definition means we need to intervene again, regardless of the fact that he bought the land through perfectly legitimate means. And so that's the problem here, is it has become, so it's Marxist and it's communist, but it has become very much intertwined with, some people call it Fanonianism, but you could say black race nationalism. It's race nationalism mixed with socialism. And the what comes out at the end of this sort of experiment or thought experiment is that the poor or the working class and a particular racial group are by definition the same thing. And if you are poor, it's only because you've been exploited or you've been oppressed. If you are successful, you can only be white. And it can only be because you have oppressed someone. And so it's this very, very one-dimensional conclusion that they get to at the end of the day. And there's no way that you can fix that without destroying things. It's not possible to fix. You can only try to fix it, this sort of conclusion that they have reached. But in your attempt to fix it, you can only make things worse.
Well, to play the tape forward with that, the logical conclusion is that these white people are infinitely, eternally going to be oppressors, no matter what they do. There is no way of breaking this cycle. And, you know, they can buy the land back, but the money that they use to buy back this land is from oppressing blacks generations ago. And they've got this generational wealth that's been passed down to them that we also need to address. And we need to get rid of that too. We need to maybe start taking their money, not just their land. And, you know, property isn't just this immovable force of your land. It's also whatever you have, your cars. And you can see how this can very quickly spiral. And I was at ARC a couple of years ago.
Oh, yeah.
I was at ARC this year as well.
I was there as well.
Yeah, I'm sure I would have seen you walking around. And a couple of years ago, I was producing the podcast Trigonometry at the time, and I was staying in this Airbnb in Greenwich by the O2 where ARC was. And I was staying in this shared place with the owners, who, one of which, they were both this black couple, and we sat down every night having these really deep philosophical conversations. It was amazing. And I found out during those conversations that one of them was the head of DEI for British Airways. And I'm producing Trigonometry at the time. I'm going to ARC.
You have your own views on DEI, yes.
So there's this Molotov cocktail for destruction that's about to go off. And I'm going to stand my ground. But no, we had a lovely conversation and we sort of fleshed out each other's worldviews. And it was great. It was really polite. It was a courteous sort of debate that we had. I like to say I won. That was very clear after that. But that's not the point. one of the things that I realized, kind of working things out live during this debate, we went back to slavery and reparations and all of this justification for DEI that's been so widely implemented in the West. One of the things that I realized is that, in principle, I'm completely in favor of reparations. It makes complete sense, like you've alluded to earlier, right? And you'd be quite an immoral person not to be in favor of reparations. The problem comes with the implementation. And the conclusion I sort of came to in that moment was that there is no other way of lifting up insert group that has been oppressed without just going about lifting up the bottom of society as a whole. Because otherwise you have to discriminate against someone. And why your example is so concerning is that there is no way to break that chain of oppression.
Exactly. And you're absolutely right. And because through this ideological thought process, they've gotten to a point where it's not possible to address that problem, especially in the way in which they seek to address it. But you can take a step back and say, well, actually, the underlying problems, it's not that difficult to address. And the irony, of course, is from a conservative perspective or conservative economical perspective, oftentimes the solution is just for the government to do less, to just take a step back, not intervene more, but intervene less, and things tend to work out because people tend to find solutions naturally where the government is by definition an artificial solution. It's someone having an idea and enforcing it onto society, and usually that doesn't work. Usually when you give people space to move, they sort of find their way around things. But this idea that it's a never-ending thing, you can already see the groundwork for that being laid in South Africa. When, for example, the International Labour Organization at the United Nations has this view on what affirmative action should look like if you apply it. And it says that affirmative action can only really be legitimate if there's some form of a sunset clause. You cannot have never-ending affirmative action. In South Africa, it is never-ending affirmative action. There's no sunset clause, and they would explicitly reject the idea of putting a sunset clause on affirmative action or race-based policies in South Africa. And so the argument that we hear today is South Africa, so they would define oppression as everything that happened since the arrival of white people coming to South Africa. When I say they, I don't mean black people say that. I mean, these ideological people in power in South Africa, those in government or the politicians. And so they would say, we have had oppression for hundreds of years in South Africa. Therefore, we would at least need affirmative action for hundreds of years in South Africa. And so you can already see that. And so the question is not, are we fixing society? Affirmative action, or DEI as it is called in much of the world, it has become this ideological thing. It's almost a religious thing, and you cannot be against it because that's the faith. The faith is DEI. And in as far as you reject that, it's some form of a heresy. And there's not even space to debate the possibility of not having DEI, because that's just how things are. That's just how things are supposed to be. And again, the point is, if you take a step back, if you read the works of Thomas Sowell that we mentioned, for example, and there are many other economists you can look at, you will see that it's not that difficult. But in South Africa, I know a few years ago, there was a poll by a think tank who they asked politicians to list their priorities. They would just say, what are your priorities? Give me a list from 1 to wherever. And they found that in South Africa, the notion of education was on average number 16 on the list of priorities for a politician. And so it's so obvious that education in isolation is not everything, because you need to have education within a sort of economic framework and all of that. But it's so obvious that education is a fundamental part of the solution. You cannot move a society out of poverty if you don't have proper education, if you don't have proper training and so forth. But in South Africa, that, if you ask them, is education important? Of course, they would say, yes, it is. But if you look at their priorities in terms of what they implement, what they spend time on, what they talk about, education is sort of a nice to have thing. In fact, in South Africa became famous for the slogan "Liberation before education." That was the ANC slogan.
Wow.
So they actively undermined education during the apartheid days, but you can still see the remnants of that today. That education has become this sort of protest tool to say, before we have land reform, we're not going to have proper education. Sort of holding it back almost as a carrot to say we'll get to education once we fix all of these other things, not recognizing that you cannot fix these things without education. And again, so if you take a step back, it's so obvious that you need proper education, and you need an economic framework where it's easier to start a business, not more difficult to start a business. It should be easier to appoint people, not more difficult as a result of regulation and all of that. It should be easier to do things in general, not more difficult. But if you go through this ideological thought process, you get to the point where you justify making things more difficult all the time. You justify moving education to the sideline, marginalizing education as a priority. You justify using race as a proxy for how people ought to be treated. And you convince yourself that if you do this, somehow society is going to get better, when there's no evidence that that's going to happen. And all the available evidence shows that you're making things worse. You're not making things better.
There's so much to unpack there. And just to hammer home the point from earlier as well, I think anyone would look at the fact that there is no way for white people to address the oppression of the past, even, play it forward 500 years, the chain keeps on going.
Yep.
Everyone would intuitively feel that something is off with that philosophy. It feels kind of anti-human and very unjust. But something that really interests me about South Africa is this flip compared to the West, with all of this DEI and oppressor versus oppressed narrative. And that's that there may be disagreement about the extent to which there is this narrative of white people being oppressors. Someone might say that that's exaggerated and people don't really think that. Regardless of that, there's not a narrative amongst anyone that the black people are the oppressors historically.
Yeah.
And with that, it's the inverse to the West, in the sense that in the West, it's the same thing, right? But it's the minority that is being oppressed. It's black people, it's people of color, it's LGBT people that are minority groups. They say that they're being marginalized in the West. Whereas here, it's the majority group that's saying that. How does that dynamic sort of change the way people go about things?
That's a very important difference, and it's important to point out, because the argument for affirmative action or DEI and these type of policies usually is that certain measures needs to be put in place to protect minorities from being oppressed by the majority. In South Africa, it's flipped. In South Africa, the argument is we need to protect the majority from being oppressed by the minority. And why this is so important is what underpins this whole thing is leftist ideology and rhetoric. And this is important because in the West, in places like America and many European countries, a lot of people naively tend to think that, remember that we are the majority, so it's good for us to make some concessions just because these people are obviously angry. You can see that they are angry. They demand certain things. So we need to concede certain things towards them so that we can find some form of an equilibrium or harmony. But what the South African story shows is that making concessions because you are in the majority up to the point where you become the minority would certainly not lead to a point where these demands stop. In fact, what the South African story shows is if you become a minority, these demands worsen. It becomes more aggressive. And it's that old metaphor, this is also, I think, Churchill, but it might be someone else, who spoke about feeding the crocodile and thinking that if you just keep feeding the crocodile, eventually it's not going to eat you, or it's going to eat you last. But what actually happens is if you keep feeding the crocodile gets bigger and bigger. And so I think it's important when people are confronted with these DEI issues to take, and this is why again, one of the reasons why people should learn from the South African experience is to take a stance as a principled matter or on a matter of principle, as opposed to simply looking at it from a tactical perspective and saying, well, I don't actually agree with this, but we are the majority, so let's concede to give away certain grounds or certain territory. And once you lose that, you lose it. And if you become the minority, again, it becomes more aggressive against you. And so the argument in South Africa, and it's up to the point where white people in South Africa are less than 8% of the population. And so now we have DEI policies aimed at discriminating against a 7% minority, claiming or suggesting that this 7% minority is somehow going to oppress everyone if you don't have DEI policies. And this obviously shows that surely there's a problem somewhere. But the question is, what is the problem? But it obviously shows that the policy is not aimed at addressing an actual problem or leading towards an actual solution. It's aimed at ensuring continued race discrimination. And the problem with especially the narrative in the West today is everyone can agree that when it's race discrimination against black people, that it's unacceptable. But once it becomes race discrimination against white people, then it becomes a debate. And maybe it's acceptable because remember the people we're discriminating against are white. And then it somehow becomes morally acceptable. And again, I think it's easier and it's just more appropriate to take a principled stance and say race discrimination is a problem by definition, as opposed to getting entangled into this sort of sliding scale tactical maneuvering, which only makes things worse.